Dr. Ashley Frawley, thank you so much for being with us. To those who perhaps aren't aware of your work, to those who aren't immersed in the social sciences, I mean, how would you describe your areas of interest and expertise?
So what I'm basically interested in is this growing tendency to communicate social problems as emotional problems. So in one sense, it's medicalization, so the tendency to see a huge range of social issues as medical issues, as individual issues, issues inside the individual mind, rather than social or structural issues as part of, the capitalist system or something like that. This tendency to individualize through the language of emotion. And part of that is also this growing tendency to take emotions themselves as problems, as like the headline for a problem orientation. So I've written a book about happiness, the rise of happiness as a social problem, how people started, particular groups in society, certain advocacy groups, started to claim that happiness is an issue. So it wasn't just this sort of value-free kind of like, let's have a discussion about, the good life. It was actually an implicit way of saying, happiness is a problem. People aren't as happy as we would expect them to be. They're pursuing happiness in all the wrong ways. And also an understanding of why things go wrong.
I mean, it's quite a counterintuitive idea, because at its core, I thought it was a pretty simple life strategy. I want to be happy, therefore the pursuit of happiness is a good thing. I want to maximize my happiness. It would be great if I were happy all the time, and it's bad when I'm not happy. What's wrong with that?
I don't actually think that sort of individual pursuit of happiness is any issue. What I'm interested in is how that became bound up with ideas of why we have other problems in society. So at a certain time, people started to claim that the reason why everything from individual or micro level issues all the way up to, like crime. So like people are pursuing happiness through like acquisitiveness or something like that. We can explain that through a misguided quest for happiness, all the way up to economic growth. So why are we pursuing as a society economic growth when it doesn't make people happier? So this idea, the way that happiness came to be bound up with an understanding of broader social problems, that's what I'm interested in. And for me, it signifies this shift away, this retreat from politics, from big questions, from deeper understandings. And it became a very explicit way of saying, economies are still going to grow. Let's not be silly, but leave that to the technocrats. You worry about you, yourself, your family, and your own happiness. And it became a way of depoliticizing, feeding into a broader depoliticization of these broader economic and very, very important political questions.
But on an individual level, you say that there's not necessarily something wrong with the pursuit of happiness per se, but are we perhaps all suffering from unattainable goal syndrome, for a better phrase, that we have an aspiration that is not necessarily going to be met, half of the time, let alone all of the time?
I find that funny that's actually portrayed as like a progressive thing, like moderate your desires. Too much want makes you discontent. I don't understand how that's a leftist idea. If society constantly thwarts your attempts, like look around, we've got like abundance that our ancestors could never have dreamed of, and we're constantly being told, can't have that, I actually think that want and desire is a very progressive thing. I often, when I was doing my research, I would see people misquoting Karl Marx, and they would use this line from Wage, Labor, and Capital, where he says, a house may be large or small, but as long as the surrounding houses are likewise small, it satisfies all requirements for a residence. But let there rise next to the house a palace, and the little house shrinks to a hut. And people say, oh, this shows that we're acquisitive and that sort of thing, and we should moderate our desires. Can you imagine Karl Marx telling the working class not to envy the ruling class? That is absolutely not what he was saying. He was saying that palace represents what human beings are capable of today. You probably built it. It is yours. Go out and take it.
So why are so many people misreading that then?
Because I think that we have lost a sense of progressive politics. We find it very, very difficult culturally to imagine a future in which we can expand and generalize wealth for the good of all of society. And I think that goes back to, the post-war period, where there was this boom, and there was this sense that, things are getting better and better, and so really abundance isn't the solution, it's a problem. It makes us bad. It's bad for our moral nature and that sort of thing. And I think that that's really when the left started to abandon the idea of progress as a solution to problems and started to see it as a problem in itself.
I mean, there do seem to be opposing trajectories here. In one sense, society has been getting more progressive. We've got greater rights. We're better off, longer life expectancy. And yet, on another graph, you know, our general levels of satisfaction are going down. Problems in terms of mental health appear to be on the rise. I mean, how can that be explained?
Well, general levels of satisfaction aren't going down. And that's the thorn in the side of so many happiness theorists, is that, you know, people rate themselves at about a steady level. I mean, it goes up and down.
So are we just moaning about it more then?
I think we're being encouraged to conceive of issues as essentially emotional problems. So we've lost the vocabulary with which to understand social problems in any other way except the individual, the emotional, the psychological. So that means that there's this huge incentive for advocacy groups to frame problems as psychological issues. So an example of this is after the cuts, and this has happened once before as well, in the 90s, but after the cuts and austerity measures, certain groups in society started to make claims about mental health. You know, the cuts had caused mental illness and give us this funding, and, you know, and it became a way to argue for funding when there was no other sort of narrative through which to say, you know, give us this money, because austerity was saying, you know, you can't have any. So it was a way of saying, you've messed things up, you know, you're going to pay for it. So in around 2012, certain groups started to say, oh, you know, 20%, for instance, of students are suffering from mental health problems. In 2015, it jumped to 80%. Now, did everybody suddenly have this crash in their mental well-being? Absolutely not.
Or did they just simply become more aware about it?
No.
Did they become well, let's be fair, I mean, the general conceit at the moment is that in terms of public discussion of mental health, we've never been in a better place.
Well, the advocacy groups actually started to define mental ill health in more expansive ways. That's what happened. So the ability to claim 80% of students were suffering from mental ill health was accomplished through the inclusion of stress. Show me a student that isn't stressed out. That used to be part of the experience, and now we're encouraged to think about that as a mental health problem.
But it's definitely still a problem, and a problem that requires dealing with, isn't it? If you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling stressed, well, surely you'd want to do something to avoid feeling anxious or stressed.
Now, you can only think about that as a problem if you are dragged into something that is totally meaningless to you. And you're doing it, if you're told that the whole point of education is to make you happy, you're going to be disappointed. Like, for instance, I want to teach my daughter that reading is a good thing. I'm an academic. I think reading is great. So I want my daughters to read. But I don't want them to read because it's going to make them happy. In fact, reading can unleash all sorts of emotions. It can make you angry. It can make you extraordinarily sad. It can direct your attention to injustice that will hurt you to your soul.
And these days it can also make you less and well informed as well.
Yeah. But what it can do, what the value of reading is that it situates you in a broader sphere of influence. So if you think that the only thing that matters is your tiny little sphere, my psychology, my feelings, that sort of thing, yeah, if something upsets you, that's terrible. Because that's the whole point of everything, is to make you're always told the only thing you can change is yourself. Be the change you want in the world. Your sphere of influence is right here. But what I think is valuable, and what education does, what reading does, is it turns you out into the world. And it doesn't matter whether or not you feel terrible, because your life has meaning. And you're willing to fight for something, or to learn about something, or to work really, really hard for something, even though it makes you feel terrible. Like, doing a PhD sucks. I can tell you. It was really, really, really hard. But it mattered. I was doing something that mattered, and so it doesn't matter. I forgot about myself because I subsumed myself into a project bigger than myself. So I think that some of this talk about, oh, stress, it's so bad for you, is actually a talk about the loss of meaning. That this whole project has no meaning for me. What am I doing here? Well, then its whole meaning must be to make me happy. Well, it's not going to make you happy.
Okay, so let's specifically deal with mental health and practitioners, those who fund it even. Everyone seems to have arrived at the conclusion that there is a crisis in this nation's mental health, particularly when we look at younger people. I mean, what's your view?
I think that two things are happening. One, there's, as I mentioned, this huge incentive to communicate problems through the injury to psychological health, because we don't have any other way of making sense of things. I mean, I can't count on the idea that you're a communist or a liberal or something like that. If I want to talk to everybody, I'm going to reduce my issue to the lowest common denominator, and that's individual feeling. We all, I don't know what our politics are, I don't know what your religion is, but I do know you've got a brain. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to talk to you in that language. So that's one thing. The second thing is that there's what Ian Hacking, a Canadian philosopher, calls a looping effect. Mm-hmm. So once you have this category that exists, it acts as a subtle invitation to conceive of yourself in these particular ways. And so, if I label a flower, for instance, it doesn't care what I call it. Mm-hmm. But if I label a human being, the kind of human being that I become has a relationship with that label. The label doesn't just sit there. I come to know myself through that label. And gradually, we do actually feel worse. We do. We are actually...
So one of those occasions in which, a rose by any other name doesn't smell.
Yeah, we are actually more fragile than we've ever been. But this is something that's culture bound. It's something that's very specific to our culture. And not everybody reacts to their circumstances around the world in the same way that we do, and nor have people responded in the same way throughout history.
Is that fragility bad, per se? Are we not just more aware of who we are, who we want to be, where we want to be, and the ways in which we can achieve that?
I think that to some extent the fragility can be a way for people to, talk about a very real problem in their life, mm-hmm. for sure. But I also think it can hold people back in a very serious way, because the way that this invitation is to conceive of yourself through these categories is presented isn't like, in this sort of variable way, but it's presented as this is human nature. Mm-hmm. This is what happens. Bad thing happens, you are damaged. Cause, effect. And you grow up in a world in which that's just the way things are. I learned recently...
But isn't that often true, though?
Well, sorry?
Isn't it often true that a bad thing happens and that has a bad effect on you in later life? I mean, it's...
No, but that's the narrative that we're given. We're given this narrative.
We're a distance away from Freudian analysis, but, but surely there are things which can happen to you in childhood, mm-hmm. which will have a lasting effect on your, at the very least, your worldview. Perhaps
at a very, very extreme end. So, the studies that people will bring out are like Romanian orphanages and that sort of thing. But in terms of the sort of everyday things that happen to us, actually human beings do have an extraordinary amount capacity for resilience. So I was saying, I learned recently that I'm a millennial. I didn't know that. I was like right at the cusp of being a millennial. But I definitely grew up in what sociologists call therapy culture. So this very powerful invitation to conceive of myself through that narrative that you just said. So this bad thing happened to you when you're a child, you grow up, and it damages you. And I just thought, that's the way human beings are. So that's how the story that I told of my life was, I am this way because of this bad thing that happened to me. And I remember I was traveling years ago when I first met my husband, now my husband, and I was telling him this story of who I am, this very sad story of it, and it was just terrible, my childhood, and all these bad things happened. And when I finished, he's listening to me, and he says, these things happened like 10 years ago. Why are you still upset? But the thing is, no one had ever told me that something bad can happen in the past, mm-hmm. and you could forget about it, that you could develop a narrative of yourself that is different than that isn't a narrative of damage, but is a narrative of, for instance, overcoming.
But aren't you, in a sense, then, saying to quite a lot of young people who are identifying as having some problem with their mental health, whatever that may be, aren't you kind of saying, just deal with it, get over yourself? And people have said that, since time immemorial. It's only relatively recently that we've started to say, well, let's try and deal with this.
Well, I think that there's a difference here. It's very important to, not misunderstand me. I'm not talking about, like, very, very serious mm-hmm. psychosis. I'm not talking about very, very serious psychological problems. I'm talking about the way that we're encouraged to, increasingly encouraged to view everyday issues as fundamentally damaging to the psyche. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm talking about. the way that we're encouraged to conceive of our flaws, not as something that we can overcome through the strength of will, but as something intrinsic to who we are, to our brains, that sort of thing. And actually, I don't think I'm saying, oh, buck up. I actually think it's really freeing because, years ago, when I was in university, I remember my roommate, she was, her mother was always telling us about, all these different psychological things. And she had like a Monday to Friday pill set with all these things. And she was telling me like, the reason why I can't get my work done is because I've got low serotonin. And I thought that's just, human nature. Oh yeah, okay, I'm learning about this. And she goes and she went on this trip to visit this obscure great-grandmother, ancient woman. And she comes back and she's telling me, I was talking to my grandmother and I was telling her, why I can't get my work done. And she just looked at me and she said, maybe you're just lazy and undisciplined. And she thought to herself, and she was telling me, maybe I am just lazy and undisciplined. Mm-hmm. And for her, that was actually a really freeing moment because it meant that she didn't have to wait for these pills to work or to see a therapist or that sort of thing, that it was in her hands. And she'd never been told that. Nobody just had the confidence to tell her, maybe you should just try a little harder. Maybe it is in your hands.
So do you think then that we are succumbing somehow to a culture of victimhood, an era in which that which defines us is the negative rather than the positive?
I think we're increasingly encouraged to conceive of ourselves as victims. And I think that that's happened because as the economic base has dropped out of leftist movements, has dropped out of any movements, what's left is this sort of moral melodrama of victims and villains. And I think that explains some of politics today, that it's all conspiracy theory and these real bad people that do bad things and these victims that suffer horribly. I mean, that's all that's left. There's no sort of structural analysis. Like, if I want to talk to you, I want to say, like, look, these problems are caused by the falling rate of profit, which is due to the law of value. Blank. Nobody knows what I'm talking about. So I go, oh, okay, how am I going to explain this? Doesn't it feel really bad to be fired from your job? And there might be some value in that, right? And certainly that romantic critique has always been around, this sort of psychological critique of capitalism. But when that's all there is, that's the issue. Then it becomes simply bad people doing bad things, and then it's just behavior management. Well, I think the problems of the world are deeper than behavior management.
No, entirely. And I kind of want to get a little bit deeper into what you were talking about there, about the left and the right, in just a second. But just in terms of this explosion in people complaining of problems, of mental ill health. I mean, it's not just the individuals that are reporting it. It is the professionals who are diagnosing it as well.
Yeah.
And so in your view, misdiagnosing it, presumably.
Yeah, I mean, it's not as simple as misdiagnosis because it does become real. Mm-hmm. That's the amazing, and that's the idea that I want to get across, is that human nature is far more variable than we're led to believe. That rather than society being simply a reflection of unchanging human nature, the categories just being a description of reality, that actually human beings change fundamentally as society changes, and as we have new labels, we change fundamentally as well. Sorry, can you repeat the...
No. I can imagine that there will be pharmacologists, psychiatrists, psychologists watching this going, well, you're wrong, Ashley. You're wrong. And you know what? I've got the degrees and the plaques on my wall to tell you that I know more than you about this.
So yeah, I think these are descriptions of the way that human beings are at a particular time. But I think that actually human beings are much, much more variable than that. And actually there's this culture that I was trying to explain. So there's this culture in which we are invited to conceive of ourselves as victims. There's a culture in which, politics has lost all meaning, and so it's all of this melodrama and this ethos, this psychological ethos through which everything is explained through, the brain and individuals and that sort of thing. All of that is really culturally important. And I have always, in my first book, that's really what I played up. And I really wanted to downplay the industry side. Because to me, that sounds really conspiratorial. It's this industry, this bad faith kind of thing. I 100% believe that the people who do this advocacy work, they 100% believe in what they're doing. But there is also a problem discovery industry that can't be ignored. There is an increasing and growing class of people whose reason for existence is discovering new problems for which they claim to have the expertise to solve. It goes back to self-esteem, happiness, well-being, and now mental health.
How does this all tie into, well, for want of a better word, how divided a culture we are today? You know, back in the day, people identified, there were distinct and separate tribes that fell under one banner, for want of a better word. Nowadays, we're all part of the same whole, but we're in these tinier and ever increasingly small, you know, categories that we ourselves are choosing and label. I mean, what do you think, for example, about the debate around trans pronouns and the explosion in people identifying trans at the moment?
I think that it's really interesting because we're at a point where we've lost sense that there's anything important or meaningful to socialize the next generation into. So we've lost faith in the idea that society is going somewhere, that society is worthwhile. You know, this idea that Western society is just, you know, defunct, terrible, is really widespread. And I think this sense that we as adults can't really control the future is being expressed through this sort of social engineering, this sense, well, the next generation will fix these problems. We've got real problems with gender inequality, that sort of thing, although I think they're probably overstated, some of these problems, but nonetheless, there are issues. And so the next generation will fix it. And so we think like, okay, gender is something we don't want to impose on the next generation, so they have to choose it for themselves. And I think that's actually a huge abdication of responsibility on the part of the adult generation, that we actually have to, you know, you have to know the rules before you can break them, right? And I think that what we're doing is we're basically putting all of this responsibility on the next generation. Okay, you guys, you create this society that's going to fix all the problems that we can't deal with. And I think that's something that the next generation is not, it's unfair to them to try and expect that. And I think down the road, we're going to see a lot of problems that come out of this. You need a sense of certainty in your life as a young person before you can start to make things uncertain, before you start to question things. Like, you know, teenagers, famously, that's what they do.
Yeah, but what problems? What are these problems that lie down the road? Because it strikes me that there are more people talking about these things in a progressive way than before, that young people, you know, have always, to an extent, been socially aware, socially active. But now there's a generation that's talking about these issues rather than, you know, the weirdos who went off to run the student union.
Yeah, I mean, I think in one sense it's really great because, you know, definitions of who we are and what we are as people and what we should be are not sort of decided in, you know, some backroom conference center. They ought not be anyway. They're worked out in reality. And that's kind of what people are doing right now, is they are throwing up the old fixities and creating something new, and I think that's quite a good thing. What isn't a good thing is when that process of questioning is disrupted, because when there are contradictions, human beings work them out. That's what we do. You know, there's a contradiction right now about, you know, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? All of these things are thrown up in the air, and as a society, we're trying to work through that. But I think what's happened is that some sections of that debate have been really chilled and really quieted in a really, really unhelpful way that stops us from being able to work out these issues in practice. So I find it really worrying and really
Are you talking about the censoriousness that some
yes,
identify
it's become
on the left?
Quite censorious, and it's understandable. I mean, it is not nice to have to constantly justify yourself, but that is the trade-off in a democratic society. You can't simply beg the question. You can't simply assert something is true and then, you know, demand the world to conform to that. You have to win that debate. True,
but aren't there some accepted truths these days that it is bad to be racist, that it is bad to be homophobic? See, I thought it was bad to catcall, to wolf whistle at women, but you've had a different experience on that.
Yeah, I think it's not completely 100% bad the way that we assert these things, because if you make an assertion and it loses its power, so it's just, it's bad to be racist. And we all know that, so we're not going to talk about it at all. And then someone says, well, geez, immigration. You go, shut up, you racist. People aren't convinced by that. And so anti-racism becomes a dead dogma. And when it fails, when the platitudes that people put across fail to convince people, then we shut down debate. And then there's always this section of society that says, but, and I think that this is happening right now with feminism, where I think that it's really, really powerful that women feel that they have a voice, that sort of thing. But also I think there's this puritanical streak within feminism, and we're all just supposed to accept that. So for instance, as you mentioned, wolf whistling. That's supposed to be just 100% bad. But I remember when I was like 8 months pregnant, I was sort of like waddling down the street, and a group of men in a car, catcalled me. And it was so unexpected that I actually jumped and screamed. and I looked and I saw these men, and they all started laughing, and I started laughing. And it was this really nice moment, actually, of just sharing this funny thing with these people, because they hadn't meant to scare me. In fact, it was the complete opposite. They were, shake that bump kind of thing. And I thought it was this really wonderful moment. Yeah, I'm invited to conceive of myself as threatened by that, as a potential victim. And I don't, some women are heterosexual. There's this sort of like anti-sex kind of thread, this sort of puritanical streak where it's like, no, any sort of heterosexuality where, your breasts being for a man, that's a real bad thing. Breasts are for babies. Well, actually, breasts are part of the sexuality of a lot of women. Men are part of the sexuality of a lot of women. Some women like to be admired by men, but we're not supposed to say that, and there's something wrong with that. Well, actually, I think that that's not so straightforward.
So where does it end? Where will we be if we don't have the opportunity to speak freely, to say challenging things, to say things that may well offend some people? Where do we end up if we don't deal with that?
I think, well, you'd mentioned before, you kind of said, why are we so divided? Well, I had said that there's this growing class of people whose reason for existence is creating problems for which they claim that they have the solutions.
Come on, examples then. That's a bold claim, so give me some examples.
So for instance, like happiness claims makers, they're making, increasingly silly arguments, I think. So for instance, 1 in 4 children, 1 in 4 girl guides, that was the one, 1 in 4 girl guides are unhappy. Well, that's actually, for all the apocalyptic claims that are made about the state of childhood, I mean, that's not bad, to think that only, 1 in 4 children or girl guides are unhappy at any given time. And unhappiness is part of, childhood, that sort of thing. But this idea, like, I'm going to locate this problem. You didn't think it was a problem before, but I'm going to, campaign to make you accept it, that sort of thing. And I've got the solution. Or like obesity, for instance. So this whole stratum of society that's dedicated to the obesity problem. So what that winds up doing is all of this sort of research and advocacy research, it takes the working class, the lower classes of society as their subject. And as an object, actually, as an object of all of that research. And it says, you people, you're victims, your social problems. And they never really think, like, maybe people don't want to be considered objects. Maybe they don't.
It's a complete denial of their agency, isn't it?
Exactly. We have a real problem in society now considering working class people as having agency, as being subjects. And we find it very difficult to understand that maybe they don't want to be objects of expertise. Maybe they want to be taken seriously. Maybe they don't want to be problems to be administered to. Maybe welfare isn't the aspiration of their life, but is the worst case scenario. I think that's the problem that we have today, is everybody is talking down to or about the working class, and nobody's talking to the working class. There isn't any progressive movement in society that says, we wonder, you're looking at this guy and you say, hey, follow that guy in the dreadlocks and the hemp shirt, and he's going to take away your beer and your ready meals, and everything's going to taste terrible and your life is going to suck. And go follow him. And people are like, no, thank you. There's no movement in society that has like an ability to take that aspiration and say, yes, you should want more. Yes, the world of wealth and culture is being kept from you, and that's wrong. follow me and the future is going to be better. That's gone. And I think the only people that are doing that are pseudo-intellectuals and charlatans at the moment. And I think as long as there's that gaping hole in politics where progressive politics used to be, we're going to see people move to the right. We're going to see working class people move to the right because they feel that they have a lack of agency, that they have no future, and at least those people are promising something.
It seems to me that we keep returning time and again to the assertion that the left has either lost the argument in the economic sphere or doesn't have anything alternative to say on that. I mean, are you essentially saying that all these problems, to an extent that we've been talking about today, I mean, we can't really get to deal with them until we see the end of capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, this is ultimately what it keeps coming back to. And then people will say, but, you know, I was just at a conference, actually, where that was the conclusion that people had drawn. And then they were saying, but we who work with parents, surely we can still tell people how to parent. Like, you know what I mean? Like, well, capitalism is going to end, so let's go into families and try to make them eat healthier. But you're not going to solve that problem, and you're just going to create even worse problems.
Jeremy Corbyn doesn't, you know, suggest to you that there might be a change coming.
I think that there's a streak in the Labour Party that is very much about, you know, increased surveillance of everyday life as a solution to problems. And that's what scares me. And that is not going to excite anybody. I think for us, there is a future that is much, much better than today. It is possible. Right now, we have the ability to create, we do it every day. We create wealth, like beyond, as I said before, beyond our ancestors' wildest dreams. And yet people are working 4 or 5 jobs to constantly reproduce their existence. That is crazy. There's no reason why someone needs to hand you a coffee. You know, you could press a button and the coffee is made for you. There is that world in which you don't have to do meaningless work, and where the incredible potential of human beings. Every human being on the planet is incredible potential. They could be the next Newton, you know, and it's being squandered on stupidity. And we need to find out a way. How do we get to that future? We can see it just beyond the horizon, and yet it's constantly being destroyed by crisis. You know, before the economic crash in 2008, the left was saying, oh, there's so much stuff. And then all of a sudden, all the stuff disappeared, and there wasn't enough for anybody. What happened? Was there a drought? Was there like a crop failure? No, the commodities rot in warehouses if they can't be sold. That's crazy. There's enough for everybody. There's more than enough. We can create a world that's much better. I wish the left was talking about how do we get there.
Given that they're not, given that you're a mother of two young girls, given that for all of this stuff to be dealt with, you are essentially talking about the world changing around them. How happy are you raising 2 girls in this world?
I am really worried about the future because there are like 6 people somewhere who are actually trying to answer those questions. You know, how do we organize things if not through, you know, capitalist production? How do we unleash all the wealth and possibility that capitalism creates without its destructive essence, without its exploitative side? There are very few people thinking about that. And as long as we are deferring that conversation, while you know, capitalism will keep doing its worst. It will keep destroying in order to create more profit, which is what it needs to do. In order to restore the profit rate, you need to have a huge amount of destruction. You know, and that can be people thrown out of work, that sort of thing. Crisis, in other words. And so I think we'll have increasingly destructive crises. It's possible that one really good way of restoring the profit rate is just flattening continents and building them again. And you know, having children, that's really scary. And you just kind of think, well, I just hope you're real far away from that. But I think that that's where the conversation should be, because otherwise, I mean, I don't think we're headed anywhere good.
Dr. Ashley Frawley, many thanks for being with us.